Okay, it looks like there's still sort of a slow stream of people coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'll start slowly so that others have a chance to start to join in. We have a number of people registered today for what I think will be a very exciting and interesting conversation about justice and governance in the learning health system, focusing on legal and ethical issues. We're really happy this morning, this afternoon, to have a number of people here to join that conversation. A couple of just quick logistical issues. The session is being closed captioned and recording. The link to the recording will be shared with all of you and the others who have registered today via the LHS Collaboratory website. There will be extensive, we hope, audience Q&A, so go ahead and answer, or please put your questions, and that will be answered into the audience Q&A, and we'll sort of go through those as they arise. Like I said, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Osagie Obasagi, who is at the University of California at Berkeley. He's the Haas Distinguished Chair of Law and Professor of Law and Bioethics in both the law school, and he has an appointment also in the School of Public Health. He will be joined by a couple of other colleagues of ours who I'll introduce in a minute, but we're going to have a conversation today about justice and governance at learning health systems, focusing on legal and ethical issues. Dr. Obasogi has scholarly interests that include constitutional law, policing and police use of force, sociology of law, bioethics, race and inequality in law, medicine, and reproductive and genetic technologies. And if you look at his work, he has a really robust and interesting way of tying all of those things together. And I think that's some of what we'll be maybe talking about today. Leading this discussion, we have two of our colleagues from here at the University of Michigan. Salome Filioun is an assistant professor of law at our own University of Michigan Law School. She studies the information economy, particularly data and people, and the automated systems that are trained on such data. And clearly in the learning health system, data is a fundamental part of what makes that system work and be optimized. She's interested in how information law structures inequality and how alternative legal arrangements might address that inequality. And starting us off today will be one of our students here at the Department of Learning Health Sciences, Aja Harris-Martin, who is a PhD student in the HILS program. Her research interests lie at the intersection of public health, operations research, crisis management, and learning health systems. I just wanted to also sort of, before we start the conversation, talk about the next sort of LHS Collaboratory event, which will be in February. We'll hear from the director of the National Institutes for Health. I wanted to mention this now in case we don't have time at the end, but there'll be registration information going out to you then. And we'll say more about this at the end. But without further ado, what I'd really like to do now is turn it over to Aja and Salome and Osagie. And if you have questions, again, put them in the Q&A. We'll have plenty of time for those. So welcome. Salome, why don't we go ahead and...
Sure. Yeah, I can maybe kick off until Aja solves some of her technical difficulties. Yeah, so thank you again, Jody, for the welcome. And I'm also very pleased to be part of this conversation with Dr. Obasagi. We really appreciate you joining us virtually here today. Before we sort of really kick things off into some more substantive questions, would you like to start off by talking a bit more about your background and some of the current research and specific areas of interest that intersect with some of the topics that we focus on here that we can maybe craft some follow-up questions on?
Sure. So first, thanks to everyone for inviting me to be here. Really excited to join you all. So as was talked about at the beginning, my name is Osagie Obasagi. I am at the University of California, Berkeley, where I am a professor in the School of Law, and also have a joint appointment in the Joint Medical Program and School of Public Health. Oftentimes, folks don't realize that Berkeley has a medical program, medical school. We do have a very small one that's in collaboration with UCSF. and it's a medical program where folks get a MD and a master's in health sciences in 5 years, and it's designed to give students an interdisciplinary approach to their kind of medical school training. And I can talk more about that later if folks are interested. So my personal background is that I have a law degree and a PhD in sociology, and I spend a lot of time thinking about issues that intersect both law and medicine. Fundamentally, my work is really premised upon the idea that both law and medicine, as kind of fields of research, approach the world as if their methods and views and theories are neutral, apolitical, objective ways of understanding society, the world, the human body, and aren't always as aware of the ways in which their methods and approaches are deeply constituted by various forms of bias. And much of my work is trying to disentangle the ways in which that bias, whether it's regards to issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, just really trying to disentangle the ways that bias has been embedded in that way, that not only the way that folks think, but the way that folks are trained. And trying to show how that bias gets embedded at the very fundamental level of training and learning and understanding the world, and showing how the very things that are thought to be kind of neutral and apolitical in principle have origins in deeply subjective biases that have been put in place to maintain certain power relations over certain groups. And so while this would be my first conversation in a learning health sciences context, as I learn more about the work that you all do, my work is deeply, it resonates deeply with the idea that as institutions of higher learning and higher education, we have an opportunity and responsibility to rethink the way that we train the next generation of professionals, whether physicians, lawyers, or any other professional, to make sure that we are consciously aware of these kind of past ways in which bias has been embedded at the level of learning, so that we can unlearn these biases as a way to provide a better service for the public, whether it's legal services or medical services, other types of services. So I'm really interested in kind of the kind of presumed neutrality of these professional fields, and having conversations that explore the embeddedness of that bias, and thinking creatively about ways to move forward in a way that encourages folks to think differently about the world.
That's so interesting. I'd love to follow up on that a little bit. As you were speaking, it reminds me of this John Dewey quote that I find myself returning to over and over in my work, which is that, I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me, but that the way we formulate the problem or conceive of a problem oftentimes shapes and constrains the way we go about developing solutions to that problem. Yes. Yes. And, you know, I'm going to take legal scholars' prerogative on this panel to ask a little bit more about how you see the role of legal scholars, legal teachers, but maybe also as in parallel medical scholars and medical teachers in reconceptualizing those problems to sort of help our students in either in our teaching or in our scholarship to sort of start to frame how they sort of engage in the world differently.
So, you know, law has an interesting way of teaching, particularly in the first year curriculum. And
teaching contracts to one else later this afternoon.
So you know all about this, right? And what I find fascinating is that the basic kind of pedagogical structure came from this kind of late 19th, early 20th century moment. And quite frankly, it just hasn't changed all that much in terms of how we think about the appropriate way of teaching. So we have these large auditoriums. So I'm sure your contract class, you have what, 60, 80, 100 students?
80, yeah.
80, right? So you're at the front of the room. You were expected to go in there and just kind of pontificate for probably what, 50 minutes to 90 minutes at a time. And the idea is that your brilliance will be exposed to the broader students. They will take copious notes. They will ask probing questions. And somehow throughout a semester that will, there'll be a knowledge transfer that will make them fantastic lawyers. And while I think there's part of that is, you know, quite traditional, there's something specific about law that has really come out of a moment where, or at least its origins in this late 19th, early 20th century moment, was one in which, you would not describe these early kind of law school kind of contexts as diverse, right? You would not describe the classroom as inclusive. And in many regards, the design was to be intentionally hostile, because it came from an idea that by creating a hostile learning environment, you can train people to be able to think on their toes and to be able to respond quickly, therefore preparing them for being able to, argue a case before the Supreme Court or wherever they are. And, fast forward to 2023, we know a lot more about learning now than we did back then, yet we haven't changed our modes of communication and conversation. Something similar is happening in medicine. I think medicine has been a bit more responsive, but there are certain aspects of our medical training that have not changed since the early days of formal medical schools being created. And so this creates a challenge, particularly as we think about the ways in which law and medicine intersect with current social movements that are demanding social change in a lot of areas, whether we're talking about policing, whether we're talking about issues around housing, whether we're talking about issues of inclusion of diverse people into the workforce. Law and medicine are in many ways at the center of those conversations. And so as we expect our students to be able to kind of go out into the world and be able to address these problems, we want to make sure that they are trained in the way so that they can understand what is at issue, what are the problems at hand, and how can they translate their professional training in a way that can be responsive to social problems. So put differently, if, for example, in your contracts class, if you are teaching it in a traditional way that is not attuned to the ways in which that formal principles around contract creation often kind of can be used in a way to kind of maintain status quo inequalities, right? So contract law in many ways, kind of the language itself has been designed to make sure that certain people continue to benefit and other people are excluded from benefiting, right? So that creates an important conversation about racial equality, about gender equality, and making sure folks are included. If you're not having that conversation about inclusion in your classroom, and the traditional conversation or traditional pedagogy around contracts is not conducive to doing that, then your students will go out into the world and not be able to kind of confront these issues as professionals. Same thing in medicine. If you're not training people to be able to understand how their formal training might have been kind of communicated to them in a way that doesn't prepare them to understand how these issues present themselves in the real world, we're failing as institutions of learning. So that's a long way of saying that this is an opportune moment to kind of take a step back and think about what it means to train the next generation of professionals so that they are both technically proficient in what they do as professionals, but also have a social and cultural competence to be able to translate that work so that it can move our communities and societies forward in a way that can be much more inclusive of people of various backgrounds.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think Asia is back, so I will maybe give her the next question, but I think just a quick coda on that. At the highest degree of generality, what we ought to be training lawyers to do is to accurately sort of spot issues, like sort of issues of injustice or issues, legal issues in the world. And, I think if we're not training them to be attentive to the ways that, for example, contract structure interpersonal relations, and interpersonal relations are often sites of profound injustice, then we're not training them to spot issues. We're leaving them blinkered or blindsided for a lot of the challenges that they're going to go try to face and hopefully improve in the world.
Just to tag on to that, I think
Sure.
you made a really important point about training people to spot issues. So we don't simply want people to understand, a certain line of legal doctrine over periods of time. That's one particular skill that we train in law school in terms of understanding how doctrine evolves over periods of time. But as you're saying, we want people to have the ability to go out into the world and see a legal issue and be able to resolve it. And I think there's something similar happening in clinical medicine as well, where we often have clinicians who are seeing people who are coming into their clinics and who are discussing problems that they have. And sometimes the solution to that problem is not a pharmaceutical drug, it's not some type of medical intervention, but sometimes that solution is resolving housing insecurity. Sometimes the issue is making sure people are not food insecure. And so I think physicians can also have the opportunity to think about how to, in a sense, quote unquote, prescribe interventions that speak to kind of social insecurities to help improve people's health outcomes. And I think, creating that next generation of professional who has a type of flexible ways of thinking about solving problems and drawing upon resources and skills that might be outside of their formal training, but yet nevertheless can be quite beneficial to the clients or patients that they see is, that's part of the next level of learning and engagement that we want folks to have.
Great. Asia, are you in a position to kick off with some questions?
I can try, and maybe I'll keep my video off.
Okay, great.
I'm not
want to give you time too,
you...
as an actual expert in this area.
Here, I'm going to try to call in from my phone and see if that's a little bit better, because I can't hear you all. So I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. That's totally fine. We can just keep things sort of rolling on here.
Sure.
So I guess to follow up on some of those conversations about helping students to sort of train and spot those issues, what are some sort of frames or sort of intellectual pedagogical approaches or academic approaches that scholars and teachers should take to try to sort of embed that sort of bioethical or social combination of bioethical and social justice understanding in how they can train clinicians to reduce disparities and injustices in healthcare, or sort of seek to sort of highlight and address those problems in their work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and
it's a big question.
I'm sorry.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah. So I think a lot of this issue stems from helping. I think we have to kind of think about the learning process as understanding how problems often do not emerge from people themselves, but the context in which they find themselves in, right? And understanding that oftentimes that solution can be institutional rather than personal. So, we live in a society where we put a lot of burdens on individuals to solve their own problems through individual transformation, right? So if you have a problem that's with your health, the idea is that, well, you need to eat better, you need to exercise more, you need to do X, Y, and Z at the individual level. Similarly, around legal issues, if you are experiencing some type of legal problem, the idea is that, well, the solution lies at your kind of personal transformations and kind of changing your own situation. And I think part of the work that this kind of training that we're talking about is trying to help people have access to resources at a social or institutional level that can help resolve the problems that they're facing. So as we talked about earlier, right? So if you find yourself, constantly in a position where, the lack of access to healthy and sustaining foods means that you have a hard time making it through the day and that you just feel bad all the time and it's causing you to be ill, then the role of the physician is to help partner with maybe with institutions that can help resolve that problem, so that you can have access to the resources that you need. Here in this example, food. Similarly with the law, oftentimes folks find themselves in precarious situation that they don't know what resources they can draw upon to help resolve their issues. So for example, around housing, right? And so as legal advocates, our job is to kind of bridge that gap to make sure folks have access to what are often kind of free legal services to help resolve those problems. So it kind of gets back to your previous question or previous conversation we're having, which is how do we kind of build the sensibility of the professional as being kind of the Swiss Army knife, the being able to, again, being able to draw upon social resources and making sure that those resources are available to folks and not simply blaming individuals for the poor outcomes, and helping them understand that oftentimes their individual problems are a function of social failures. And as a result, how do we find the resources that you need to improve these outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both this comment of yours and some of our prior conversations just has me thinking about the Combahee River Collective statement about interlocking forms of oppression and injustice. And, you know, a medical or a legal problem just can't be isolated from the material, cultural, and social conditions that people find themselves in that just make it absolutely impossible for them to sort of flourish. And again, you know, from like a legal perspective, if you can't see those sorts of like profoundly socially constituted features of your client and address those, you're not maybe doing your job
Exactly.
as a legal advocate, and I'm sure same for a clinician.
Yes, that's a fantastic point, and it gets back to the issue of learning in terms of, if you think about like the structure of the university, right? So, for example, here at Berkeley, you know, the law school and the School of Public Health and Medical School are the two most physically distant buildings on campus, right? So they're about a mile apart uphill, right? And now, you know, as you can imagine, I get my steps in every day, kind of going back and forth. But that type of design has created a situation where the law school and the School of Public Health historically have not had the kind of tightest relationship, just because of physical proximity. You know, it's hard to go to encourage folks from one school to go to talk to the other and those type of things. So a lot of the work I'm trying to do is trying to build those relationships so that folks can start thinking in an interdisciplinary way about their work. And, you know, so much of the training historically in law and medicine, so much of that training has been so isolated, right? You know, we think about the law and we don't really, we're not really in conversation with other disciplines. Similarly with medicine, we think of medicine as being a narrow field where we are training doctors to be able to, you know, operate on the body, or training, you know, doctors to be able to kind of solve problems specific to the body. And we're not always aware that resolving those problems can often be informed by information and knowledge from our colleagues in the social sciences or the humanities or other professional schools. So, you know, I think as the university continues to evolve, we have to think about how do we make sure that all of our units are in conversation with other units to think more broadly and differently about resolving those problems, because there's so much knowledge that, you know, we can all draw upon that can provide, you know, novel ways to, you know, help the folks that we work with.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, I think my distinguished co-panelists now ready to
You know,
take the baton.
I thought coming to campus would give me stable internet, but I found out that it still didn't work. So, but now I'm connected to an Ethernet and I'm connected to a wall. So I apologize for the technical difficulties, but the conversation happened as it should have. And I think it's a perfect segue. Your last statement, Dr. Obasagi, about the interdisciplinary nature and what you're trying to focus on. And I think that's the crux of the learning health system model, on how we use the data and turn that into our knowledge, and then how we use that knowledge and turn it into practice. We have professors and faculty from around the university, although we're housed in the School of Medicine. And I think as we think about this learning health system model and what that means for ethics and justice and also equity, there are some top kind of issues that we're grappling with as a department as we think about those things and what that means for our research as independent researchers and also for the larger learning health system model. So one of those things, at least in our ethics class, the foundational report that we read is the Belmont report. And we kind of pick it apart to know or to think about the gaps that it creates, especially for us as a learning health system. We're no longer thinking about the model of clinical research is in this silo and then medicine and the care delivery is in another silo. We are trying to combine those two. So as you think about kind of combining the clinical research and care delivery, there becomes some ethical issues, especially around informed consent is a hot topic that we grapple with as a department. And there's been a recent, not so recent, about 10 years now, which is crazy, a framework released by Fadden, which kind of talked about maybe 8 obligations that we have as a learning health system. But I want to hear from you, combining the public health and the law background. What do you think top ethical issues should be when we think about how ethics and justice is incorporated into this learning health system model?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's interesting you mentioned the kind of the Belmont report as a foundational document that you all start with. I think that's a really interesting approach. You know, when I teach bioethics, the document that I start with is the opening statement from the Nuremberg doctors trial. And for me, this is the perfect intersection of law and medicine to understand what our ethical obligations are to one another. So for those of you, just a brief history lesson. So, you know, one thing, so Arthur Caplan, who's a bioethicist, and he talks about how the field of bioethics emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust, right? So this framing of bioethics as a relatively recent field that emerged out of a realization that the role that physicians and scientists played in this horrific moment in human history highlights the need for a new generation of professionals to provide oversight on the work that happens in science and medicine. And so that's the beginning of the field of bioethics. So the field of bioethics, even though we can understand its birth coming out of this moment of Holocaust, continued to evolve in the second half of the 20th century with other kind of revelations around Tuskegee and other kind of human subjects research that went wrong. And so the field kind of evolved over the last half of the 20th century to what it is today. But if we understand this moment, this kind of Nuremberg's doctors trial, which was the kind of the first public global articulation of precisely what physicians and scientists did in participating in what was human torture and genocide in these Nazi concentration camps, and how it was thought of, or it was imagined as being unthinkable that these otherwise respected researchers would engage in such horrific behavior. That fundamentally changes the way we think about not only issues of oversight, but what does it mean to train doctors if their previous training made it possible for do this? And so I find this document to be so important because it is kind of the beginning of an important conversation that medicine and science are not these inherently neutral and apolitical practices that by definition always will be oriented towards improving human health. That is to say that there, at least at this moment, we saw people using their medical training and their scientific training to hurt, maim, and kill. And part of what comes out of this document with the Nuremberg trial is this kind of implicit promise that part of the reason why we are going through this legal process, you know, and this was a prosecution of those who participated, is the idea that this was a statement that this type of behavior is unacceptable and can never happen again, right? And so in particular, the eugenic ideologies and sensibilities that shaped the Holocaust and its horrific actions towards various groups, that ideology has to, in a sense, not only cease in and of itself, but also be disentangled from the ways in which it shaped what was then thought of as appropriate medical practice. And so I find this document to be that core statement that can shape the values that we bring to training the next generations of physicians and scientists. And for me, I find it incredibly powerful to come back to it as a way to understand kind of where we were, the promises that were made out of the Nuremberg doctors trials, and then making sure that our contemporary trainings are consistent with those values of making sure that we are respecting patients as humans, that we're promoting their health, and make sure that physicians and scientists and other kind of medical professionals understand this dark history so that it is never repeated. And so I can go on and on longer about this, but part of my work is trying to understand how, even though this document was supposed to be the end of eugenics and eugenic ideologies and practices, those practices persisted into modern times, and we still see the legacy of eugenics in some of the work that is done every day in science and medicine. So a lot of my work is trying to highlight the continuities of some of the eugenic practices in terms of past and present and what people envision as the future, and try to remind people that we've made this commitment, that we know that these eugenic practices are quite harmful, and that we need to make sure that we don't revisit what was a truly horrible past.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think what comes out to me, or what I think and what I try to grapple with, is because of the Belmont Report and the trials in the Holocaust trials and us grappling with that as a society, what happened after that was this disentanglement of this is research and then this is medicine. Yeah. And now with the learning health system model, we're trying to combine the two, recombine the two in an ethical manner. And as we think about that, how we use our patient data more seamlessly for our research, some of which sometimes patients know about, and this happens every day. We know that this isn't, something that is new, but how do we as a department or other researchers, how can we take an ethical stance or make sure that we're attaining to our values as we kind of try to merge this science and medicine, in your opinion?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I've worked with a healthcare organization that is similarly trying to think about how to have a more fluid kind of vision of the relationship between clinical work and research work, right? Because on one hand, it can be quite powerful to kind of reduce some of the barriers between the two, right? In terms of allowing the clinical side and the research side to inform one another for the broader goal of improving health. However, this history that we're talking about cautions us to ensure that we do our work for the specific and sole purpose of individual patients themselves, and not necessarily for any other type of ulterior motive or goals such as research goals. That is to say that the risk that we run is that if we aren't always clear about the distinction between research and clinical work, sometimes, patients' individual desires can be somehow obscured in furtherance of research goals. And so part of your question is, how do we make sure that we protect patient interests and patients' goals at the same time while furthering various research agendas? And I wish I had a straight answer for that, right? It's very context dependent. It's very kind of protocol dependent. And I think the primary value has to be transparency and communication. That is to say, individual patients have to know that if there is this kind of deeper engagement with the research side of the house, they have to know that A, that that's happening, B, why that may be beneficial or not beneficial for them at certain moments, and C, the various ways that they can choose to not participate if they don't want to, or move into a different type of protocol where the interactions do not have a research arm as part of it. And so I think we really have to find ways to prioritize and ensure patient autonomy so that they are engaging in the research arm with clear eyes and a clear knowledge that if they feel like they aren't getting the treatment they deserve, that they can move on to other options.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think that brings up another question. The idea around autonomy, it's an American value in a way. And so hear me out. Hopefully I don't say anything off the wind, but
I know where you're going. This is an important point.
When we talk about public health, right? And I think COVID-19 and also the flu epidemic right now shows us that we as individuals affect population health. And that's that kind of public health centric idea. And then when we try to combine public health with the individual, like what that individual wants in medicine, what ways do you see us potentially, I guess, combining those things in general, right? Like the law, public health, and medicine are very distinct areas in America. Yeah. And sometimes they don't always kind of agree. And when they do, it's this beautiful nexus. But we found that it's really hard to kind of create this loop. So what's your advice for when we think about those things, as we think about the greater need of the public health and population health versus individual patient wants and needs?
Yes. So fantastic question. So I'll start off by saying that I think we had so many incredible public health professionals step up during the most recent COVID pandemic, and who did amazing work to service our communities and to make sure that we had a really vigorous public health response to that problem. Okay, period. However, at the same time, one of the disappointing aspects of the COVID pandemic is that it highlighted that it highlighted the extent to which the American public does not have a good understanding of what public health is. That is to say that, and let's be specific about this, right? We're gonna have a very open and honest conversation about this, and I think it's important to kind of recreate the timeline of how and why we lost that public health sensibility. So if you go back to January and February of 2020, and we understood that this pandemic was coming, we as a society had a very good public health understanding of what needed to be done. And this led to the shutdowns and to the protective orders of making sure that we, at a moment where we didn't have vaccines, that we engaged in forms of social isolation to protect ourselves. And everything moved to Zoom and things of that nature. And then if you remember, when we got to April and May, and the first reports of who was dying from COVID came out, and we found out that was largely Black and brown folks and working class folks who didn't have the ability to socially isolate, that they were disproportionately dying. That's when you start hearing these initial calls for opening things up, right? And 2.5 years later, we are where we are, right? So this is to say that part of the reason why the kind of initial public health framing around COVID failed is because, quite frankly, folks saw who was dying and who was vulnerable, and people stopped caring, right? And it's difficult to disassociate that sensibility and response from the broader eugenic history that we have in our society and in American medicine. That is to say that we are more than willing to sacrifice the lives and well-being of people who are not valued and are seen as kind of not central to the society. We're happy to sacrifice that in the name of individual freedom. And so it's a long way of saying that we have a lot of work to rebuild that public health sensibility that values each and every person as a important part of our community, and that is not so open and willing to sacrifice certain people for the individual freedoms of others. And we've gone down this road now where I'm not sure how we kind of recapture that sensibility, but that has to be the work of public health going forward. And quite frankly, as I kind of survey the landscape, I'm not sure if our leaders in public health are as committed to that as they need to be. That is to say that, while we certainly have people in public health who are committed to issues of health equity and making sure all communities are doing well, I would like to see this to be a bigger part of the agenda to kind of rebuild a public health sensibility that includes us all. And I hope we get there.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think it goes into another question that I have around health disparities in general, which you alluded to. And we know that a large part of the health disparities in America are rooted in racism and rooted in these kind of constructs that are the lived experiences of humans every day. However, we also realize that law was used, right, to then perpetuate racism in America. And although those laws were then, disbanded, rewritten, there was never a restorative justice that was enacted to then make up for the centuries and the decades of harm that it had on the American people. So what do you think the role of law? I know we mentioned public health, but what is the real role of law as we talk about health equity and embedding health equity and addressing it in our greater kind of population?
Yeah. Sometimes I tell my students, sometimes you have to sue people to get justice, right? That's what, in part, what law is there for. And what I mean by that is, I think you make a very good point, which is this idea that you have centuries of bad behavior that has allowed resources to flow to certain communities and away from others, that has locked in forms of privilege and disadvantage in ways that align with the color line in our society. And part of your question gets at this idea that, it's not enough to simply stop doing bad things and expect that and think that that's equity. That's not equity. That's not fairness. That's just, people stopping or ceasing to engage in forms of behavior that have harmed many, many people. So your question is, well, how do we kind of get back to a place that puts people in a position they would be in, but for the centuries of bad behavior. And so this is where we have to be creative about law and think about fairness and equity in ways that move beyond the kind of individualist framings and that tends to shape American law. So, Salome, as someone who teaches contracts, I'm sure she can very eloquently describe the problems that come when you have a legal system that is premised upon individual transactions and trying to get group or population-wide fairness and equity out of that system that only is oriented around individuals. And that's the rub right there, right? That is to say that it's difficult to say on a kind of group level or on a population level that a certain group has been unfairly treated because of actions and behaviors that started, decades ago, and to try to use a current legal system that is only that prioritizes individual litigants who can point to individual bad actions that happened to them because of the behavior of another individual. And so, this is where, as legal scholars and legal professionals, as we take seriously the issue, for example, of the health impacts of these bad behaviors, we have to kind of develop flexible ways of thinking about law that can capture these wrongdoings and provide some type of population level relief. And, there isn't any real corollary in law to the idea of, population health or population level of remedies, right? There's not a concept that captures that. So you have for example, the class action doesn't really capture that. There's other types of ideas, but we need to think about what can our approaches look like that. What are the approaches that we can create that go beyond providing remedies for individual plaintiffs and can be used to kind of engage in that population level restoration of communities? And we'll see what we can do. But at the same time, there are a lot of great lawyers working on these and other issues, and it's just a matter of helping the law evolve to catch up with the harms that we're discussing.
Yeah, thank you. With that, we'll see where the topic of medical reparations goes. I know that I'm watching that. But Salome, I want to pass the ball to you.
Yeah, start talking about law. I mean, yeah, it's interesting sort of reflecting on this and reflecting on what I hope to try to convey to students in contracts class, which is that I think of law, contract law, all of our laws, not just sort of informed by racism, but deeply one of the sort of key social institutions that constitutes racism, right? Materializes it and makes it a feature of our social structure. And I think part of the issue here is that in things like affirmative action law, in our standards for standing in front of the federal court right now, in our discrimination law, in the sort of litigation around education and choice, what you're really seeing, particularly with the Supreme Court that we have now, is, places where we've attempted to move past the purely formal equality mode and do some tiny foothold measure of redistributive justice or sort of substantive response has been totally eroded and pushed back on. And you're in a real kind of back foot in a lot of doctrinal areas in law right now. And I guess I would love to hear Dr. Obasagi speak about this in the medical context. In my own area of data, it's really hard to try to think about how we try to get people into court. We can't even get into court to sue on a lot of informational harms, because purely informational harm that doesn't have an economic connection to it, you don't even get to be in court for. We die on standing, which is, for the non-lawyers in the room, how you even just the court just dismisses your cases, you don't even have a reason to be in court. And where that leaves a lot of people with respect to sort of informational justice and, data justice, surveillance justice questions, is really thinking about, well, maybe the courts are just irretrievably individualistic And what we do need are sort of legislative responses, institutional responses that can actually be vehicles for counterpower. And I would love to hear of any sort of thoughts about how you think about like opportunities, you know, in law, like good litigating, it's like, well, the court is bad. So where are other strategies? Where are other sort of opportunities for building and creating counterpower to actually get the kinds of reparative, and substantive justice that's required?
Yeah, no, this is a really important point. And, you know, if you think about, for example, the first iteration of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, you know, so much of those issues that were being addressed were substantive inequalities, right? So issues around being able to desegregate schools, being able to have a job, right? These are substantive inequalities where people were denied access to certain resources solely because of the color of their skin. And the law, at least in response to that initial civil rights period, responded positively to open things up to make sure that, and specifically that state institutions and state actors did not participate in those forms of discrimination. And then the private sector was addressed later with various civil rights statutes. But what you're getting at now is, I think, is a question that really kind of is the focus of a lot of my work, which is that the questions that, or the hurdles that people are facing now are much more about procedural inequalities. That is to say that legal doctrine has developed a procedure that prevents people from ever being able to go to court to complain or submit a complaint about an injustice or inequality. So in the work I do on policing, for example, the whole doctrine of qualified immunity was just made up out of thin air in the 60s as a way to protect police officers from even facing suit for issues around police use of force. And so there are a number of instances like that. You know, you mentioned standing, other kind of legal doctrines that are put in place solely for the purpose of preventing people from even using the court system to achieve some form of justice. And so in terms of what do we do in response, I think it's a two-pronged approach. One, we have to have a serious conversation about the procedural aspect of laws to make sure that process itself is not used as a form of discrimination. But secondly, and you kind of suggested this earlier, that we have to kind of ramp up our engagement with the political process. And, you know, this is the old answer of vote, 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 right? We have to create a political process that can hold our laws and legal actors accountable. And the political process can be an important kind of way to kind of make an end run around some of the barriers that have been put in front of people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We have a few minutes left. Asia, did you want to ask sort of a final question? I don't know exactly when we're going to turn over to audience Q&A, but want to make sure we have room and time in our schedule for that too.
Yeah, I think it was the question that I wanted to start off with, and I think it would have been perfect, but it's a perfect way to start off with the audience Q&A. So I think it's super important to just understand where a person comes from and their philosophy and the way that they see the world. So Dr. Obasagi, I want to know, how do you see the world as it relates to ethics, justice, and equity?
Wow. How much time do we have? It's a big question. This could be it's a dissertation topic or a book topic. I see the world as we just have to do better, right? So part of my value system is steeped in the idea that the institutions that we are engaging with today in terms of law and medicine are fundamentally the same institutions they were 200 years ago, right? And while we've tinkered with things around the edges to make things a bit more inclusive and fairer, the way that we go about our day-to-day work in law and medicine has largely not changed in terms of the fundamental expectations that professionals and practitioners have with the clients or patients that they serve. And so, you know, my vision and my values are kind of based in the idea that we have to have a reckoning around that, and that in order for law and medicine to truly be inclusive, and to truly involve everyone, we have to have the courage to fundamentally rethink what we do and why we do it. And, this is not a unique contribution that I'm making, but the failure and resistance to what I think of as a fairly clear, straightforward claim shows the extent to which there is a small group of folks who continue to benefit from existing arrangements and will not allow for change simply because they don't want those benefits to go away. And so we have to tackle the very basic point that there are a certain small group of folks who continue to win with the current arrangements and a certain large group of people who continue to lose. And those numbers are out of balance. And we have to do what we can to reorient these fields to make sure that more people can continue to thrive in these environments and make the change that they want to see.
Thank you so much. And so I'm going to sort of start to bring in some of our audience questions, and which very much sort of span many of the things you've already touched on. But I'll start with sort of some of the legal questions, and then go into, there's some questions about sort of information and ethical obligations of learning health systems, and then some of the stuff you talked about at the very beginning with respect to sort of education and professionalism. There's a couple of those too. So start with the sort of legal question from Lauren Taylor. One of the things I've often wondered is whether the law offers tools for communities to hold hospitals and health systems accountable, particularly for meeting the obligations of the nonprofit form. In for-profit corporations, we have shareholder activism. Is there a ready analog in the nonprofit space?
Okay, can you repeat the last part of that? I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that there are for-profit corporations, there's shareholder activism. And the question is whether there's something similar for the nonprofit to hold hospitals and health systems accountable for the communities that they serve.
Ah, okay. Yeah, so that's a tough one. And I think I have a good sense of where you're coming from in terms of how some of the hospital systems that are nonprofits engage in some truly bad behavior, and how do we hold folks accountable. And I think, there are traditional avenues, so these nonprofits have boards and other kind of leadership that are, supposed to oversee things, but, sometimes just kind of old school shaming works wonders, right? And particularly for those organizations that pride themselves on, or that claim to pride themselves on, either a certain set of religious values or a certain set of kind of commitments to the community, yet they engage in behavior that fundamentally goes against those values. At some point, you have to openly have conversations about how a nonprofit entity is sometimes behaving like a for-profit entity at the expense of the very communities that they serve. And sometimes that can be a way to raise awareness about that behavior that can lead to further conversations. But I think that's a really important issue. And I've certainly seen it myself. And it's, I think particularly around the issue of medicine, sometimes there is there can be a corporate for-profit sensibility that embeds itself in medical practice, regardless of this actual space that you're in. And this can be as simple as, the idea that oftentimes physicians are told not to spend more than 6 minutes with a patient, and they are, even though they may be in a nonprofit space, they have this kind of corporate sensibility in terms of how they are addressing their various patients, and it's very monetized and quantified in terms of how to reduce expenditures. And so we have to kind of think about ways that, for example, as a questioner was saying, that if you have this kind of nonprofit kind of goal and sensibility in terms of how one engages the public, we have to have our kind of day-to-day activities align with that, with those practices. And how do we make sure that aligns, and how do we hold folks accountable? And I think that's a really important question.
Okay, thank you. Another question I think is a little sort of related from Danielle F. As health equity becomes more significant, what will be an ethical way to measure changes in unconscious bias for large organizations?
Right. So I often pause at the idea of measuring unconscious bias. You know, we could have an entirely separate conversation about unconscious bias, implicit bias. I often pause because oftentimes when we have discussions about measuring unconscious bias at an individual level, it then devolves into a conversation about what individual transformations we as individuals have to engage in to become better people. And I think of unconscious bias and implicit bias as social structural phenomenon. That is to say, it's not about individuals, you know, buying a particular book or doing an individual training. It's much more about how do we kind of structure society in a way that captures those unconscious biases and makes sure creates some type of some level of safeguards to ensure that those unconscious biases don't have an adverse impact on other populations. So I would just kind of halt at the conversation of measuring unconscious bias and try to shift the conversation a bit in terms of, we know that certain biases exist in society. They are there, right? What are the safeguards we're going to put in place to counteract those biases so that the targeted population doesn't have to live through the adverse implications of those biases? So I think it's useful to kind of change the framing a little bit.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Another question from a different Danielle. Legal teams within learning health systems are often tasked with minimizing institutional litigation risks for the system, creating tensions between legal teams and the practitioners therein. The legal teams might advise providers in what they can and cannot do to minimize the litigation, but how can health systems transform their legal teams to better facilitate equity within systems, which are actively trying to identify those systemic failures so that they can work to innovate solutions? So how do you, in some ways, how do you just work with your legal team?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, you know, oftentimes as someone who kind of exists at these boundaries between law and medicine, you know, oftentimes I talk to folks and the expectation is that the conversation they want to have about bioethics is how not to get sued. And I try to think about bioethics as less of a defensive posture and more of an offensive posture. That is to say that how can we use our ethical guidelines, sensibilities to embed a set of values in our day-to-day practices that improve kind of the work environment for practitioners and the clinical environment for folks to come in for healthcare needs. And I think that type of proactive way of thinking about what ethics can do, I think is a much more productive way to approach things than one that kind of focuses on kind of minimizing exposure to litigation and other issues. But, you know, clearly if you're in a large healthcare organization, you know, one has very practical things that one has to be concerned about in terms of litigation and being sued. But I would hope that there will be a bigger conversation about how to kind of just identify the values that the organization wants and making sure they are consistently present in day-to-day operations.
How do you, this is my own question, but how do you sort of view the toolbox for getting people and organizations to do the right thing? Right? I had a public health law professor who was like, doing the right thing is not, it's like, I admire that about public health, is the sort of social justice of things, but like, it's not a convincing argument, if you will.
Yeah. So oftentimes doing the right thing is not a convincing argument because it costs money. And so my experience is that people often don't have a problem with doing the right thing, except for when it affects that bottom line. And so again, this becomes an issue of, you know, clearly identifying what one's values are, and understanding that sometimes in order to have a healthy organization, it might lead to financial costs, but those financial costs have benefits on the back end that could be quite beneficial for the organization. And this is what I was talking about. I think you put your finger on it, but what I was talking about earlier about sometimes there's a corporate sensibility that embeds itself in medical practice that really has to be examined, because that corporate sensibility might work well when we're talking about widgets and other type of kind of inanimate objects. But when we're talking about care for people, we have to kind of broaden our vision a little bit in terms of understanding what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions about AI. Let's see. there's two of them. I'll just start with the first one that came in from DJ Humphreys. How do you see AI becoming more important in learning health systems to get patients to the right providers for the right treatment for the needs they have? And how should HIPAA be considered in using patient data to train AI? Maybe two different questions, but that's.
Yeah, so I'm quite skeptical of AI,
Okay.
in large part because oftentimes automation can lead to certain efficiencies, but the difficulty with that is that those efficiencies can often bring in and embed the very types of bias that we're trying to avoid, right? And so while AI can be quite powerful and help assist in things, parts of an ethics of care is going slowly, right? And being attentive to what might initially be thought of as minority experiences or minority perspectives that are the noise in the AI signal, right? But oftentimes we need to kind of orient our standards of care around what are thought of as fringe experiences, precisely because they help identify broader problems. So it's a long way to say that I think the tendency within AI is to kind of flatten some of the very minority experiences that we want to kind of pay attention to. And we have to make sure that the knowledge that goes into any AI system is doesn't simply think, well, I should say that the knowledge that goes into the system has to be appreciative of the importance of minority perspectives, opinions itself, that don't get kind of washed out by the numerical majority of other forms of information that might come to dominate how the AI system works in of itself. Mm-hmm. So that's something I think we have to be careful about.
So the Mira has I think a good follow-up question to that. I think one of the big challenges for health equity in an era of digital medicine, like AI-driven care, is that our existing tools for recognizing ethical challenges may not apply. What will we need to develop strategies to see digital forms of inequity? Or sort of how do you counterbalance that sort of issue? I think that's what she's asking, sort of how do you counterbalance those issues that you just raised in terms of the data being blind to the experiences and needs of minority populations? Yeah,
so I think part of it is that you have to find ways to oversample, right? So if you want certain values that might be a minority data point, but if you want those values to be central to how the AI system kind of operates, then you have to find ways to kind of oversample so that has the numerical presence needed to inform the AI system. And so at some level, that kind of contradicts what AI is all about, right? So you want AI to be able to make certain judgments based upon the overall size of the data set. But on the other hand, this is where the human touch is really important, right? Because we're coming at it from the perspective that not all data points are equal. There may be some data points and experiences we want to be overly representative in how the AI program makes decisions. And so, folks are working on this, but, having a consistent value that kind of builds our AI decision-making that identifies and prioritizes certain experiences as being particularly informative for how we want that system to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Sort of a related, I've heard some people say we should move forward with the AI system because it actually might create that time for the people in the system to spend more time with their patients or with, it could actually, that's sort of the sort of techno optimism behind AI. To a certain extent.
Yeah, I'm not a techno optimist. I think I am much more concerned by the idea. I mean, it's a traditional problem of garbage in, garbage out, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the over-reliance on AI tends to undervalue the remarkable and drastic ways in which issues of bias saturate every aspect of everyday life, right? And so if you come at this from a perspective that understands that everyday life is full of both visible and invisible ways in which bias shapes every form of decision-making and how that will inform the AI system in ways that we may not even understand or predict, then that informs my kind of general pessimism about AI to be able to kind of move us to what may seem to be a quote unquote colorblind world that is free from those biases. I don't trust any particular machine to be able to automatically filter out bias in a way that will productively help or assist those groups or populations that have been historically marginalized. Sometimes as humans, we have to do the dirty work of self-reflection and reconstituting society in a way that is fair and equitable. And I'm not sure any program can do that.
I think it's fair. So that sort of brings us to what I think are our last two questions, but we have time. So if folks want to add to the Q&A or the chat, we can certainly get to some other issues before our time is up. But we have two questions, one from Elias and one from Lynn. Let's see, I'm going to start. I'm going to start with Elias because he asked his first question first. So what common philosophical foundations do you see in both medicine and law that professionals can use to engage learners and patients as whole people with social lives, i.e. communities that consist of people who are understood as having both bodies and minds?
Okay. So with the first part of that, what common philosophical principles? Yeah,
philosophical foundations in both medicine and law.
Okay, so this is a question about what we can use to see people as full people.
That's right.
Yeah. So, you know, I draw a lot of my work draws upon traditions of critical theory. So I draw upon issues around critical race theory, feminist theory, queer theory, critical class theory, as ways to kind of engage that process that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation of kind of deconstructing presumptions around neutrality around certain institutions and learning spaces, and understanding how those spaces and institutions are constituted by the exclusion of certain people from those conversations, right? And so once I think that allows us and frees us to kind of rethink the spaces that we inhabit in ways that can be much more inclusive of everyone who is part of that space. So this is another way of saying that, you know, it's important to come to work in both law and medicine just aware and with our eyes wide open about the history behind these fields that is, you know, quite troubling, and understanding how the prestige of these fields and importance of these fields was constituted by both the exclusion and exploitation of women, of people of color, and other minority groups. And so our general unwillingness to reorient these fields, as I mentioned earlier, comes from a desire of those people who benefit to continue to benefit. And so we have to kind of continue to push the conversation and continue to learn and understand how even what seems like small things, like the tests that we run in a clinical setting, sometimes those tests, such as kidney function, can come from a quite disastrous history that can be quite harmful to people of color. And so while some people might say, well, it's not worth advocating around that, I think we have to understand that even these kind of very small battles about the tests that we use in a clinical setting can be important for starting broader conversations about making sure that the practices that we engage are truly reflective of the diversity that we have in society.
Yeah, thanks. I think this plays into the next question nicely. So can comment on some of the equity and ethical issues that play out in interprofessional healthcare teams. As an example, physicians typically do not have time or readily available information to address social determinants of health, such as housing. Mm-hmm. Do you see interprofessional practice subject to similar inequality dynamics that parallel the patient-physician power inequality? And if so, how can this be addressed so that the patient gets the best care?
Yeah, great question. And it's something that I recently experienced in my life. I had a family member who was quite ill, and we were thankfully in a university hospital setting where the doctors were quite open to the idea of partnering with other professionals, such as social work professionals and other professionals. And that kind of comprehensive care was quite beneficial for my family member, and I'm quite thankful for it. And I think that is something that many people can benefit from. I'm not sure all physicians operate with that level of awareness of kind of the need to reach out to other types of resources and other professionals to help solve problems. And so I think, again, this can be part of the, to think about what does it mean to be kind of a continuous learner, as a professional, is kind of just, making sure that part of that learning process is kind of drawing upon the other resources that are at one's disposal to promote the health of one's patients. And, you know, sometimes you might have medical professionals that just aren't aware of, for example, all the remarkable work that other type of social service professionals engage in, and how that overlaps with their clinical work. And so just continue to educate, continue to let people know, continue to kind of have trainings that allow people from different professional backgrounds, allow them to learn about each other's work and skill sets, so that they can, you know, form great partnerships to help their patients.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great note to end on. Salome and Aja, if you guys have any final questions or thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a strong point to end on. I don't want to muddle things up.
Yeah, so I think thank you so much for being here this afternoon and this morning, wherever you are. And again, we're just deeply appreciative of your of this conversation that we were able to have. And it is sort of all of the issues that you brought up. I mean, it does sort of, it's their topics for conversation, right? There's a back and forth and a sort of level of complexity in all of them that requires a sort of a dialogue to really understand and sort of unpack, right? And so I'm glad we were able to do that a little bit here. And I'd like to invite everybody who's still with us to sort of continue that conversation, either amongst themselves or to reach out to us if you have questions that come up. The slides and recording will be available on the LHS website, and I think you'll all get them on via some form of email. The next LHS Collaboratory event is in February with the director of NIH. That's being co-sponsored by the dental school, and will also, I think, be a very exciting, sort of interesting presentation, a little probably different than what we got to talk about today, but equally important to the conversation around how we're going to create learning health systems that are better than the health systems that we have now. So I think if I missed anything, please put it in the chat or let me know. But again, I'm so grateful for everybody being here today, and Happy New Year, and thank you for attending. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.